side. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many people attending our second open webinar on prefab. For the remainder of the year, we'll do an additional 2 webinars on the key trends in the construction industry. So think about digitalization, sustainability. But for today, we will focus on prefabrication. So if you join in late, this session will be recorded. So later on, you will also get the recording. But I'll kick off right now to ensure that we will stay within the time limit. So I would like to start with a short introduction about USP, what we do, and why we have the information we have on prefabrication. Then we will dive into the prefab topic at depth, and then we'll come to some conclusions. As Marina mentioned, at the end of our session, you will be able to ask some questions via the Q&A session, and I'll try my best to answer them. So USP Marketing Consultancy is a market research agency specializing in the construction, installation, and home improvement segments. We work with a team of approximately 70 people, are very much internationalized, and we utilize our market experience that we've built up over the past 30 years to help our clients with either ad hoc tailor-made market research or via our multi-client research portfolio. So our multi-client research portfolio are basically off-the-shelf reports, focusing on key target groups in the business value chain: architects, building contractors, installers, painters, consumers, handymen. And all of these researches are based on quantitative market research. And we do these interviews by phone in native language. And every quarter or biannually, a report is published focusing on one of the key trends in the industry. For today, I will be heavily leaning on the information from the European Architectural Barometer and the European Contractors Monitor, because they are, of course, most involved when it comes to a prefab topic. I already mentioned that we provide our clients with a lot of information, insights. Well, obviously, we work for the major manufacturers of building materials in the construction industry, but we also work for the wholesale branch organizations and many other actors that are active in this business area. Now, with that out of the way, let's start with the presentation on prefab. I already mentioned that for this presentation, we will be focusing on information from the European Architectural Barometer and the European Contractors Monitor. Both of them had a special topic of prefab. Both of them came out last year. In the case of the Architectural Barometer, end of last year, the Contractors Monitor, beginning of last year. So the data is still very fresh. Of course, every 2 years, we give an update on these topics. So the new reports for the Contractor Monitor will have prefab this year for the ones that are interested. Now, for the European Architectural Barometer and all of the information you'll see on architects, it's worthy to note that we interview architectural firms with at least 2 employees and upwards. For the European Contractor Monitor, it is contracting companies, so general builders with at least 5 employees and upwards. And all of the interviews, all of the information is based on fact and hard data through quantitative market research, telephone interviews in native language. Now, to start off with an old mantra I always use, that is that the construction industry needs to become faster, cheaper, better. And faster, cheaper, better is really something that for the industry is really important to achieve, because there are big challenges in the industry with higher prices, a high labor shortage, sustainability demands. So the industry really needs to become faster, cheaper, better. And one of the ways, of course, this can be achieved to build faster, cheaper, and better is through prefab. And through prefab, I think it's logical that you can build faster, you can build cheaper, and you can build better. So let's start first with a step back. The prefabrication in the construction industry has been steadily increasing. The share of prefab in the construction industry has steadily been increasing in the last decades. Now, why is that? Well, first and foremost, we have a very high labor shortage in the construction industry. And the way we used to build our buildings in the upcoming decade or so, this will become increasingly more difficult because, simply put it, the hands are no longer there to build in the old-fashioned traditional way. Now, we also see that the construction industry has digitalized quite rapidly in the last couple of years. For example, building information modeling, the adoption rate amongst architects increased significantly. Now, why is that important? Well, if you want to do prefab right, and especially more complex forms of prefab, you really need to have a proper digital model of a building. And again, building information modeling is a very important element here. But also the continued push towards sustainability. If you build elements or complete 3D building segments, you can really reduce the waste compared to on-site construction. And because you're building in a controlled environment, you can also achieve higher levels of sustainability than on the job site, or at least that is the principle and the idea behind sustainability driving more prefab. Now, what we also see, of course, is that especially in Northern Europe, but this is the case in most countries, there's a high housing shortage. There has been a high demand, and this really means that there needs to be an increase in the speed of construction. Now, in the last year or so, 2 years, we saw new build volumes decreasing due to the higher inflation rate, higher cost of construction, higher labor costs, and also the higher finance cost. But still, the underlying problem is there. There's a huge housing shortage, and how in the future are we able to build enough houses to combat this, keeping in mind that we will have less professionals working in the industry. And last but not least, we see a lot of new technologies. For example, in the past, when we looked at prefabrication, it was typically only for low-rise, because the higher you build, the more legislation is coming into effect, and the more you really need to have new technologies to be able to build prefabricated much higher. Now, these new technologies have been developed or are still being developed. So more and more you can build higher and higher and higher using prefab. Now, I mentioned a couple of times labor shortage, and I just want to focus on that a little bit, because I think labor shortage in the construction industry will be one of the key challenges. And how bad is it already? Well, we've asked the architects, to what degree do you have or see labor shortage issues in the execution of your projects? So not for their own firms, but in the execution of their construction projects. In the Netherlands, almost 70% of the architects state that they are restrained due to labor shortage issues. It's the lowest in Italy with 25%. If we ask the contractors, general builders, again in the Netherlands, labor shortage issues are the highest. Almost 70% of all contractors, bigger contractors in the Netherlands, state that they are faced with labor shortage. Again, in Italy, it's the lowest with 18%. But we can also ask installers, both HVAC and electrical installers. Also here we see a big labor shortage problem. It's the biggest in Germany, with 3/4 of all installers stating that they are severely hindered by labor shortage. And last but not least, for example, we can also look at painters who are more on the finishing side. Also here, 90%, almost 9 out of 10 painters in Germany state that they are faced with severe labor shortage problems. And even in Italy, which is clear has the least problems when it comes to labor shortage, but even still there, half of all the painters foresee labor shortage problems. And if we look towards the future, it's clear that we are not at the end of the problems, because the average age in the construction industry, and this is just for painters, but this accounts for almost all target groups, is relatively high. So we have still a relatively large share of baby boom and Generation X, which will start to retire in the upcoming decade. And if we look at, for example, the Generation Y, they only represent a small portion of the total labor force. So there will be significantly more labor shortage problems. Now, how can we combat this? One important element, of course, is prefabrication. So let's take a look at prefab, the share of prefab in projects. So let's start with the architects. We asked them the question, what share of your total projects contain some form of prefab? Now, what's clear to see is that in the Netherlands, the share is the highest with 60%. So in 60% of all the projects architects do have, could be new build, could be renovation, prefab is being applied. Now, in the other countries, this share is lower. On average, approximately 30%. It's the lowest in Italy and the UK. For the UK, though, I must note that, of course, we take a representative sample for the entire UK. If you look at, for example, the metropolitan areas, Greater London, Greater Manchester area, there, the share of prefab is, of course, significantly higher. But in the countryside, it's not. So in most countries, approximately 30% of all projects contain some form of prefab. In the Netherlands, it's 60%. We asked a similar question to European contractors, so general builders. So there you see that the share of prefab in projects increases even more. In the Netherlands, 71%, and in Belgium, Germany, Poland, Italy, it's approximately 40 to 50%, and in the UK, France, Spain, it's approximately 25 to 30%. Now, we must also note here that, of course, we took a representative sample, so contractors, 5 employees and upwards. If we start to look at the share of prefab on a European level in their projects, we clearly see that the bigger a company is, the higher the likeliness that they are using prefab more often in their projects. 36% on a European level, 5 to 15 employees. It goes up to almost 50% for the large companies, 16 employees and upwards. Now that's architects, contractors. They are still relatively early in the business and the value chain. If we look, for example, a little bit deeper in the business value chain, HVAC installers is the example I took here, we see that still deeper in the business value chain, prefab is being used quite often. So we asked a little bit different question here, but we asked the HVAC installers, do you use prefab in your projects? Not a percentage of projects, but just do you use prefab? So here we see that for the countries that were covered by this research, approximately half of all installers in Europe are prefab users, with the highest share in the Netherlands and France. Now, if we look at architects, if we look at contractors, and to a lesser degree also installers, we can see that in the Netherlands, the share of prefab is the highest, especially for the construction side. Now, why is that? Why is the Netherlands showing such a high level of prefab in projects? Well, first and foremost, the Netherlands has a long history of prefabricated housing. After the Second World War, there was a significant housing shortage, and between 1945 and 1975, approximately 225,000 houses, to, depending a little bit on the definition, 450,000 houses were built utilizing prefabricated methods. So there's already a very long history of using prefab in construction. Secondly, the Netherlands is also one of the most digitalized countries. And this is also the case when you look at the construction industry. BIM usage amongst architects, for example, is by far the highest in the Netherlands compared to all other European countries. Now, why is this relevant? Again, if you want to do prefab, and especially complex prefab right, you need to be digitalized more and more. And in fact, a BIM model becomes almost mandatory. Now, we also saw that in the Netherlands, we have a very high labor shortage problem. It's the highest in the Netherlands, in fact, for architects and contractors. And this is, of course, pushing the market towards more usage of prefab. And last but not least, the Netherlands has a very prefab-friendly culture. So residential new build, in the Netherlands, we like to build very repetitive houses in large numbers, which, of course, is ideal for the use of prefab. Now, if we look at some latest numbers, sorry, this slide is only in Dutch, but I'll do my best to translate it. Here you can see the number of industrially built houses. And with industrially built houses, the definition is it needs to be wind and watertight within 10 days and being built within 50 days. So you clearly see that since 2021, there was a quite strong increase. And it's expected that the usage of industrialized construction will reach 23% of all houses being built. So 23% of all houses in the Netherlands will be built using an industrialized construction method. Now, it begs the question, of course, what is happening there with what materials are used? Well, it is still, at least in the Netherlands, a very much mixed image. So we've got wood, steel, concrete. But what's clear to see is that, and it's not just for the Netherlands, but for all forms of prefab, wood-based solutions are being applied more and more and more when it comes to prefab. This has, on the one hand, to do that it's quite an easy product to use. On the other hand, of course, the sustainability push and the idea that wood-based solutions are more sustainable is really driving the share of wood in the total mix of materials used for prefab. Still, concrete in many cases is dominant, but they are losing market share, if you can call it like that, to wood-based solutions. Now, let's turn back to the European level, and let's look at the share of prefab in projects and the future expectations among European architects. So basically, what we clearly see is that since 2018, there has been a very slow and gradual increase in the share of prefab in projects amongst architects. 2023, when we had the latest measurements, it was 29%, but you can clearly see that the growth between 2019 and 2023 was limited. Short-term expectations from architects is that it will not grow explosively. But if we look at their more long-term or mid-term prognosis, 2030, you'll see that they do expect a significant uptick in the adoption rate of prefab in projects. Now, if you look at contractors, we see more or less the same image, but in fact, they expect even a slight drop in 2025, and then the continued growth in 2030. Now, with all of the statements I made, labor shortage issues, higher construction costs, higher sustainability demands, why do we see short-term the growth of prefab not really accelerating? Well, there are various reasons for this, and I'll come to that in a second, but it's mostly due to the decreases in new build that we see in the market currently. Of course, prefab is more applied in new build than in renovation. So if the total project mix is shifting more to renovation and less to new build, then the share of prefab will also decrease. But before we come to these conclusions, let's look a little bit closer to the differences per country. So again, here we ask the architects their projections for the share of prefab in 2025 and 2030. So in all countries, we see that they expect quite a significant increase of the share of prefab being used between 2025 and 2030. In some countries, it's a little bit less pronounced. For example, in France, but still they project a significant growth in, let's say, prefab usage in the total project mix, according to the architects. Now, we can look a little bit deeper in the business value chain again, and for example, look at the HVAC installers. So we asked the question to HVAC installers that were already using prefab, so prefab users, do you expect that the need of prefabricated products will increase or decrease in the upcoming 3 to 5 years? Well, I think the image is quite clear here. A vast majority expects an increase either slightly or significantly, and there's only a very, very small percentage that thinks that prefab usage will decrease. But even if we ask the non-prefab users, so the installers that are not currently using prefab, even they foresee an increase in the usage of prefab. Now, I already told you that there are some key reasons why we see that prefab short-term is not growing at a faster rate than you would anticipate, bearing in mind all of the market developments. The first one I already mentioned, less new build and more renovation. We see in the European market that new build volumes are down in almost all European countries. Again, having to do with the higher cost of financing due to the higher interest rates. And this is clearly impacting the total project mix. So more renovation, less new build. But we also see that, especially in urbanized areas, you've got more complex and more aesthetical designs. Now, prefab has gone a long way to accommodate more complex and aesthetical designs, but still, if you really want to do something special, it's quite hard to do it with a lot of prefab. Sticking to the topic of urbanization, well, we still see in most European countries a continued push towards urbanization. And what do we see in the urbanized environment? Mostly very much high-rise. So high-rise construction. And we know, even though it's slowly changing, that prefab is mostly applied low to mid-rise. So the more high-rise construction you have, the less likely it is that prefab is applied significantly. Now, last but not least, there are also some new players operating outside of the traditional business value chain. So prefab builders that do not require the help of an architect or a contractor. So this is skewing also a little bit the data, of course, because this new target group or new players, you could really call them new, but they are basically operating outside of the traditional business value chain. And thus that share of these companies and the prefabricated houses they produce are less in these numbers. Now, maybe just to emphasize this less new build, more renovation, I took here Germany. And we have our own forecast of building volumes. And if we look at the share of renovation versus new construction in a country like Germany, you can clearly see that since 2022 and projected for 2024, there is a significant drop in new construction. It's partly offset by more renovation, but still the market in total in Germany, according to our prognosis, will be negative in 2024, especially the new build part. So again, this is one of the reasons why short-term prefab usage will grow, but not as explosively as anticipated. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper in what do we mean with prefab, because prefab is, of course, a very large definition. What is prefab? So in our researches, we basically have 3 different types of prefab that we investigate. We've got the prefabricated plain unfinished elements. So those are just precast floor, facade elements, roof elements without any form of finishing, without insulation, windows, or installation. So typically, if you look at it old-fashionedly, concrete floors, walls, ceilings, these kind of things. One step further, a little bit more advanced, are the prefabricated panelized systems or elements. So examples here are basically the same: wall, floor, ceiling, roof, facade panels, but including some form of finish. Can be insulation, windows, installation, even sometimes paint. So basically unfinished elements, but then with some form of finishing. We call that panelized systems. And then last but not least, of course, the prefabricated modular buildings or volumetric elements. So entire houses, but also bathroom pods, dormers, kitchen pods. Those really are pre-assembled units before arriving on the construction site, 3D prefab. Now let's take a look at the prefab market and how we can divide this. So we've asked the contractor to look at their projects that included any form of prefab, and to divide then the type of prefab. So if we look at contractors, we see that from 2018 to 2022, there was a big increase in the usage of prefabricated plain unfinished elements. There was a big increase in usage of prefabricated panelized systems, and there was a very slight increase in prefabricated modular buildings. Now, overall, because we see the market for prefabricated panelized systems growing strongly, to a lesser degree also modular, you could say that the prefab market is becoming more advanced, according to the contractors, when you just look at the projects, the type of prefab that was applied. If we look at the architects, we see this image even a little bit stronger. Between 2021 and 2023, the share of prefabricated plain unfinished elements in fact decreased from 60% to 50%. But the share of panelized systems increased from 32% to 37%, and the share of modular increased from 8 to 12%. So here you again see that the market for prefab becomes more advanced. It shifts more towards panelized systems and modular building elements. And also when we've asked contractors in this case about what type of prefabrication do you expect to grow the most in the upcoming years, their indication is prefabricated panelized systems will grow the strongest. They also expect growth for prefabricated modular. They also expect growth for prefabricated plain unfinished elements, but the biggest growth they foresee in panelized systems. And if we ask the architects the same question, we see more or less the same answers. The biggest growth in panelized prefabricated systems. Now, this trend can be observed in many countries. The only, let's say, big deviation here would be Germany, where the architects expect more prefabricated plain unfinished elements, let's say, percentually speaking. But in all other countries, you clearly see that the share of panelized systems will increase the strongest. And in fact, in some countries, you also see their expectations for modular being very high. For example, Poland and the UK. So the market is becoming more advanced. Now, this in fact is well and truly needed, considering how low the productivity gains has been in the construction industry. On the left-hand side, you see productivity, real gross output per hour worked for the US in this case. So for the construction and all other industries combined. So you see that something's going wrong there, because for all other industries combined, the output per hour worked increased significantly. And in fact, for construction, it only increased slightly. And the same for UK productivity levels, construction versus general economy, you can see there's a big mismatch. Now, even though prefab is being applied more often, it also depends, of course, on what type of prefab are we talking about, because certain types of prefab will not really increase productivity. Why is that? Well, in order to get some serious gains in productivity levels, prefab production needs to become more industrialized. In many cases, what we see is that prefabricated panels or elements are basically constructed offsite, but on an on-site manner, meaning that you still need qualified labor, you still need a lot of man hours to basically achieve that. But if we move towards more industrialization, where you can see some examples here, then you can really make big efficiency gains and increase productivity of the construction industry significantly. And in other words, an example I like to use a lot, we really need to industrialize, just like Henry Ford did with his Model T. Really a transformation from off-site construction in an on-site manner to really industrialized prefabrication construction. Now, I also want to share with you some insights on the materials used, because if we are talking about material usage, you will see that there are some shifts ongoing. I already mentioned a little bit, let's say, the very positive view on wood-based solutions. So we asked the architects, what structural basic materials do you expect to be dominant for fully finished prefabricated facades? Well, you clearly see that their expectation is that wood will be applied much more than concrete, even for facades. Those are their expectations. If we look at inner walls, also, of course, here wood was being used a little bit more historically already, but still, their idea is that wood-based solutions will be used significantly more for fully finished prefabricated facades. Inner walls. And then the same for pitched roofs. Obviously, again, we clearly see that wood was being used there already, but still the expectations are very strong. Now, if we look at the contractors who are, of course, have more their boots on the ground, really working with prefabricated solutions, we ask them, what is the dominant construction material type for prefabricated plain unfinished elements? Here we see slightly a different image, because now we're looking at what's currently being used. And if we you look at the prefabricated plain unfinished elements, it becomes clear that except for pitched roofs, concrete is still very dominant. But again, wood-based solutions are increasing their application share. But concrete is still very dominant. If you look at the prefabricated finished elements, again, same question, what's the dominant construction material type? You clearly see that the share of wood in many cases is slightly increasing. But still, we see that concrete, according to the contractors, is still very dominant, but the share of wood-based solutions is increasing. If we look at volumetrics, except for the facades, we see that, again, wood-based solutions are in fact being used more even than for the other elements. And again, this share is increasing. So concrete still remains a very dominant material type when it comes to prefabricated elements, either finished, unfinished, or even volumetrics, but the wood-based solutions are gaining ground rapidly. Now, I already mentioned a couple of times how prefab is becoming more advanced. It's becoming more advanced both in the fact that we see that there are more advanced prefabricated elements being used, but also it is being applied more often towards mid to high rise for the future. So we asked the architects, what's the dominant size, project size for prefab? And here you can still see that low-rise up to 4 floors is the majority of where prefab is being applied, 75%. Then we have mid-rise, 5 up to 10 floors, 18%, and high-rise, more than 10 floors, only 3%. Again, due to technology changes, due to legislation changes, we expect more increases in mid to high-rise. And if you take a look at the full report, you will find that information there as well. But this is the current status. And if we look at the different countries, you can see clearly that, for example, in a country that's quite far advanced when it comes to prefab usage, in the Netherlands, we clearly see that a much higher share is already being applied for mid-rise, 5 to 10, but especially for high-rise, more than 10 floors. It accounts for 10% of prefab usage being related to project size. So there is still a lot of gain to be made for applying prefab to mid and high-rise buildings. Now, we also asked the question, well, in what type of projects or buildings is prefab applied the most? So you can clearly see it is mostly residential orientated, according to the architects. So the number 1, multifamily houses, apartment, number 2, detached houses, and then at number 3 is the first, let's say, non-residential application area, offices. If you look at the comparison between 2021 and 2023, in all cases, prefab has been applied more in almost all segments. Also in offices, we see a strong growth. Terrace, row houses, semi-detached houses is more or less the same as in 2021. But for the others, we do see increase slight or strong in the case of offices. And if we ask the architects, for what building parts do you expect the usage of prefab solutions to grow the most? Might not be a surprise, but according to the architects, it will be mostly facades, external walls, and internal partition walls. Now, as we're closing into our time slot end, just coming back to our mantra: faster, cheaper, better. Well, we asked the architects, what are the key reasons? Why do you see a shift towards more usage of prefabricated elements? Well, faster to build, cost efficient, cheaper, faster to produce, again, faster, and constant quality of product manufactured in a controlled environment, so also better. So they do see the link towards faster, cheaper, and better. And we also ask contractors, and they share this opinion, because we asked the question slightly different here. But to what degree do you disagree or agree with the following statements? The best solution for labor shortage, large group agrees, reduces the duration of a project, so faster. The best solution for energy efficiency, so better. Of course, they also see some negative impacts. For example, it requires new organization, it requires new skills, different tools, and it requires digitalization. Now let's wrap things up and come towards some form of conclusions. So what do we foresee for the future? Well, the future for prefab looks bright. Even though maybe short term it will not grow as explosively, the future of prefab does look bright. Why? Labor shortages will inevitably drive the market towards more prefab. We already see higher levels of prefab, and industrialization will improve the benefits of using prefab, thus increasing the adoption speed. As legislation demands are met and technological advances are made, prefab still has a huge potential to grow for mid and high-rise construction. And last but not least, we see in the European construction market digitalization increasing significantly, and that will facilitate and accommodate more complex prefabricated designs. And last but not least, the increased attention towards sustainability will also drive the market to more prefab. And this requires, of course, some explanation. Well, first and foremost, prefab construction can lead up to 90% reduction in material waste compared to on-site construction. So in leftover material waste. So there's a big gain to be made there. And typically houses built in prefab are designed with more energy efficiency in mind. The streamlined production process of prefab consumes less energy than traditional construction. Also, typically more eco-friendly materials are being used, both leading to a lower carbon footprint. And prefab construction significantly reduces the overall construction time, ensuring quicker occupations of buildings. And this does not only save cost, but also minimize the environmental impact associated with prolonged construction activities and related emissions. However, in my opinion, it will be an increase, a stronger evolution, but not a revolution. It will be a continued increase in the pace of adoption.